Dave's a libertarian.
Yeah.
Doesn't apply.
Yeah.
Okay, so I messed up. I called Dave woke right when I was looking for examples. He said something that sounds the same as what they say. I didn't even know who he was. He's just this vague character that was on the fringes of my awareness on Twitter. He has a big following, but I didn't follow him, so I didn't know who he was.
James Lindsay, thank you for sitting down with me here at FreedomFest.
Yeah, well, here we are, FreedomFest.
Yeah, so we're here at FreedomFest. We're going to be doing a panel tomorrow, me, you, and Jennifer Say, but I wanted to sit down with you because your background is so interesting, and our worlds kind of intersect in interesting ways as well. But before we kind of get into what's going on in current culture, I want to get into your background because you have an interesting story that I don't know if my audience is really going to know. So, like, go back to what you're probably most famous for and how you kind of got into the space.
I think you mean the grievance studies affair, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so back in 2016, so we'll go back a little before that, Peter Provocation and I, we've been writing together for a few years. We have actually already been writing some anti-woke stuff. We're very frustrated with what everybody at the time was calling third wave radical feminism. And sometimes the term by 16 social justice warriors had crept into the lexicon. So we're very frustrated with those. Peter's getting harangued by his diversity office at school at PSU, Portland State University, where he taught. I wasn't, but I was getting harassed online. We were trying to argue. They said, well, you guys don't have it. Well, first they said, you're white men, so you can't criticize gender studies, which doesn't make any sense. And it's called the genetic fallacy. But then they also said you don't have a PhD in it, which is this kind of credentialism. So Peter and I were frustrated, unable to criticize what we now call woke. And we didn't know what to do about it, but we kept trying. And then we were tracking like the most ridiculous academic papers that were being published. We were following a thing called real peer review on Twitter that would put out these papers that were real. One of the papers that caught my eye was, I don't know exactly when it was, but it was in Gender and Society, which is the biggest gender studies journal in the world. And it was about the social construct of menstrual blood. And I was, roll your eyes, here we go. And then it turns out in the middle of 16, another group at Portland State University on $500,000 almost, it was like 480 or 460 or something $1,000 of National Science Foundation money, published a paper about how the science studying glaciers in order to combat climate change needed to be turned feminist and indigenous and admit other ways of knowing, including indigenous mythologies and feminist art as a way of studying glaciers to humanize it. And we were shocked by this. So we decided these people need an academic hoax. We can't criticize it, but we can expose it. If we can get something published at the peer review level, we don't need that is a credential. We don't need to get a PhD. We must know enough about it to criticize it. And we can throw egg on their faces and show how ridiculous this scholarship is in a way that gets a lot of attention. So it's a little bit of a PR stunt, but a lot of, trying to bring attention to this problem and break through this barrier that prevented our critique from being taken seriously. And so we wrote a trial balloon paper looking backwards. It wasn't at the time, it was what we were going to do. And we called it the conceptual penis as a social construct. We said that penises are not truly male anatomical organs. They're better thought of as a social construction that leads men to be macho and make bad decisions, causes all of the problems in the world, especially climate change. And it ends up getting picked up by a small predatory journal called Cogent Social Sciences. And we spike the football anyway and say, we proved gender studies is fake. Well, we hadn't, because the journal was so bad. And so, we got some critiques, some friendly, some unfriendly, that said you didn't really prove your point, and here's why. But if you had, better journals, more papers, blah, 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 you would have proved your point. So Peter and I got on the phone and said, why don't we do that? So we wrote 20 more papers that became called the Grievance Studies Affair. We recruited Helen Pluckrose to make them more scholarly and rigorous and to really help us understand what we were looking at so we could do them better. And through 2017 and 18, we wrote all those papers. It turns out 7 of them got accepted for publication. 4 were actually in print by the time we got caught by the Wall Street Journal and had to go public and end the experiment. One of them, which was about analyzing rape culture by watching how people reacted to dog humping at the dog park, won an award for excellence in scholarship in feminist geography by its leading journal called Gender, Place, and Culture. So, I mean, we could talk for the whole time that we're going to talk today about the different papers and how ridiculous and funny. They were out there, right? They were not normal papers. These were just extremely stupid, funny, or horrifying, depending on what we were trying to accomplish with each. And in every case, we had one through line. We started with the conclusion and figured out how to make the literature work for us to get there. So it's definitely conclusion-driven reasoning.
Yeah.
Not where does the evidence lead? This is what we want the evidence to say. Let's make it say that, which is obviously a problem, right? And we submitted them. What we ended up proving is that the peer review system is only as good as the set of peers. If they have a corruption, that corruption gets translated into the literature they produce, into the professional apparatus that they operate within, whether that's the professional academic structure, whether that's the like conference scene, whatever it happens to be. And so, you know, we exposed academia as publishing woke literature at the end of 2018, kind of on the international scale.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really interesting too, because that was like the beginning of a lot of this intersectionality, but it had been creeping into what, I mean, you had intersectionalists talking about, you know, getting into taking over the institutions, right? Way back in what, the 70s, 80s?
Yeah, but I mean, Rules for Radicals was like 71.
Yeah.
Counter-Revolution and Revolt was 72. He explicitly calls for the long march into the institutions of academia in that book. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so you really exposed that they had met their goal.
Yeah, right.
In a lot of ways, you showed that. And so I think I kind of started to come into know who you were when you were talking a lot about critical race theory, right? And so I thought it was fascinating when I started to learn more through critical race theory about how critical theories are, postmodern, neo-Marxist ideas.
Yeah, right.
I learned that through you. And then I started seeing it in the LGBT space being taken over that way. And that's when you started talking about queer theory. So can you explain a little bit more about like how all, I guess, critical theories kind of tie together and into one intersectional being? Yeah,
I mean, that's a huge topic too. Yeah. Just right after we finished the Grievance Studies Affair project, Helen Pluckers and I we wanted to tell the world what we learned without focusing on the stunt itself. So we wrote the book Cynical Theories, and we covered a lot of these intersectional phenomena. We covered post-colonial theory, postmodernism first of all, but then post-colonial theory, critical race theory, queer theory is like chapter 4 in that book. Some aspects of feminism and gender studies, fat studies, disability studies. We covered a whole bunch of this, and we kind of started to lay the groundwork. So critical race theory kind of was the one that I decided was to put the most emphasis in first. So in 2019, I started basically researching it full-time beyond the depth I needed for cynical theories, and traced it back into its critical theory roots. I mean, it seems obvious now that you have critical race theory, drop the middle word, critical theory, but nobody believed at the time that that's what it was. It was a huge argument for years. People were like, oh, James, you're crazy, it's not critical theory, even though it's literally critical race theory. And you have the creator, Kimberly Crenshaw, saying, well, we were critical theorists who were doing racial justice, and we were racial justice advocates who used critical theory. That's where we came up with the name. So it took me 2 years to convince people that critical race theory is a critical theory. But the critical theory comes from a guy from the Frankfurt School called Max Horkheimer, and he said basically Marx had some stuff wrong. One of the things he had wrong was that capitalism immiserates the worker. It doesn't. It allows them to build a better life. This means the working class is going to be stabilized. They're going to like their lives. And what it means is we don't have any way, he says, to articulate what an ideal or a good society would look like on the terms of society that we have. You can't talk about socialism on capitalist terms, in other words. So what we can do, he said, what is allowed to us, because this system is now all pervasive, right? What we do have the ability to do is criticize the aspects of the existing system that don't live up to the ideal expectation. Okay, so you compare society to some socialistic ideal, and you complain about every aspect of society that doesn't do that. And that's their whole model. That's the critical theory, right? But the idea is that there's an ideal version of society, and what it's lacking is the oppressor versus oppressed conflict theory that Marx laid out, where oppression as a dynamic between two identity-based or class-based poles is the fundamental organizing principle of society. It doesn't mean oppressor versus oppressed. It means oppressor versus oppressed is how all of human society through all of history is necessarily constituted. And it is the job of the awakened Marxist, class conscious, or woke to undo that, to take control of the circumstance and unmake the oppression to get to a society beyond that. So the critical theory says, well, we can't tell you what that better society looks like, but we can tell you how this society is not that. So that evolves later into how, you know, everything like going outside is racist, or like probably going outside is homophobic, probably going outside is patriarchy. You know, it doesn't matter when I say going outside, I just mean any single thing, because every part of the system or menstrual blood is no longer going to be thought of as something that actually comes out of your body during a biological process. It's now going to be thought of in terms of its social implications. Just like going outside has to be thought of in terms of its social implications, or rocks or trees or anything else. And what they do is say, well, if we had the ideal anti-racist or socialist or liberated or queer or whatever it is society, then we wouldn't have these contradictions or these problems. And so we have to criticize, as they believe, the root causes of them tucked within the existing society and its social structures that produce them. And that, ultimately, I finally figured out after studying it with all these fields, is what it means to be woke, is to do that.
Okay, so, and I think that's interesting. Now, do you find it's harder to define or to attack the idea of queer theory other than critical race theory? And the reason I ask is I find it, I would say yes, because I think critical race theory has a long-standing history. It's got the 5 tenets. It's got everything that you need to lay it out there. Queer theory is very undeveloped, but when you look at it from abroad, you can. I've laid it out on the 5 tenets of critical race theory and just tied those into queer theory. Like they said, race is a social construct. You have all the same tenets, but they're not laid out as developed. So I think it's harder to fight to combat that and to expose it for what it is.
For 2 reasons, really. One is what you just, or maybe it's 3 reasons. We'll see how they pan out. But what you just said, it's very amorphous. In fact, I wanted, when we were doing the grievance studies papers, to make a joke and write a paper called Queering Queer Theory, and to claim that queer theory itself had become too normative, so we have to queer it too, right? But then I went and checked in the literature, and there wasn't just one, there were already like 3 or 4 papers or book chapters titled that. And I'm like, they already had that idea, right? This is already a huge discussion in queer theory that they've become too normative in themselves. So it's like critical race theory is kind of very, frankly, semi-materialist and concrete. It talks about real things that are happening in law just badly, or in economics just badly. And then queer theory is just all over the place by definition. And any attempt to solidify or concretize it is anti-queer. So therefore, it's against the program, and they don't do it. So it's amorphous, right? It's like gooey. The technical way to describe that, and maybe this is the second point, is that queer theory is purely deconstructive. Critical race theory, if we're honest about it, is a grift. It is a system to set up a grift for political and economic gain for certain people, and that grift is called affirmative action in general. Okay, so it's a grift. That's why you're not allowed to change race. It's not about getting over race. It's about getting over racism by reversing it so that you can create a grift. Queer theory is not about that. Queer theory is about dissolving all understanding of everything. So it's a purely deconstructive enterprise. What that does practically, however, is it means nobody can understand anything for themselves, and they need basically like a queer spirit guide to tell them, you know, this person says they're trans and yes, and that person says they're trans and no, they're making fun of it, right? You need somebody who's steeped in the queer theory to understand that. So this is the second reason that it's just harder. And the third reason is actually very prosaic, is queer theory is disgusting. You cannot read queer theory out loud.
That's true.
You can't do it in public. You can't put it on. The only podcast I've ever put on YouTube that got demonetized is where I was reading from queer theory because the overt sexual themes got me demonetized. And you can't read a page of queer theory almost without running into something like even pedophilia or outright sexual stuff. Like even the book, I don't know what you can get away with, so bleep me as you need to, but I'm just going to say it. Even the book where the word queer is defined, which is Saint Foucault by David Halperin, written in 1995, has like a 2-page like exploration of the transformative and deconstructive power of anal testing as a how do you tell people what's in this if every other page is so disgusting you can't read it in public? So there's this third reason there that it's just difficult to communicate. It's amorphous, it's deconstructive, and it's disgusting. So you can't actually like stand on a stage in front of 1,000 people and say, here's why it's bad. By the way, censor, because I can't, like, look at even the books they write for middle schoolers. You can't read them they're in the library and you can't read them out loud at a school board meeting because they violate like FCC like code or whatever.
Yeah, I think what you said is pretty interesting because the way that it works together, and when I also look at how when we fight against it, or it's actually the implementation of these ideas into society as well. I kind of linked back, in 2020 we saw the George Floyd riots. A lot of those riots were to push this idea of critical race theory onto society. But what the people on the left needed to do, what the woke needed to do, was actually have black people be the ones that were rioting, and they weren't doing it.
Yeah.
And so, and after that, they said, "Oh wait, we can use this metamorphosis of queer theory and identify into a category, and we can just do the violence under the guise of trans."
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and so obviously the violence of the BLM critical race theory riots flowed into the overt sexuality of the, gratuitous, inappropriate for public or children displays that they incorporated what used to be Pride Week, then Pride Month, and it turned into this kind of
Pride Year.
24/7, 365 or whatever, right? And it kind of turned into this like very carnival, but like carnival in Brazil has its own its own internal code. It's pretty debauched, but it's not like disgusting. And this was just sexual provocation after provocation. And then the drag queens, where it went from drag queens in the classroom, which is objectionable enough, and it's actually if you read their own literature about it, it's deliberately trying to, I'll just say the G word, groom children into alternate modes of kinship and sexual being. But beside that, it just got grosser and grosser. They started being, I don't know how many drag queens can keep it together without having to do the splits and like a breakdancing move or whatever, and thigh-high boots, but not very many apparently, because it always turned into that. And so this was a huge provocation against society. And the difference was, I think they thought that there would be acceptance of the racial justice movement. And I don't think anybody ever thought there would be actual acceptance of the over-the-top queer stuff. It was just a provocation, in my opinion.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, though, because they want to... But then the society did. They went with it.
Some did.
And this is part of the issue, too, I think, is we see this wide array of it online. But I'm also now believing more and more in dead internet theory and seeing that it's probably just very small amounts of activists are using bots to create these narratives that make you feel like society is moving this direction when it's really not.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of, this is part of why I think it was a provocation, there were a lot of out there actually in public drag queen events, right?
Yeah.
And there were some in my town that turned into in Tennessee, which turned into a scandal. There were lots of them in Knoxville that I knew about, north of where I live. And so, this was a thing. And they were real, but the largest concentration of them, to the best that I could tell, were in Texas and in Idaho, right?
That's true, yeah.
Of course, there were a lot in California, New York, and Connecticut, and these very, very deep blue states, Michigan. But there were a really disproportionate number in Texas and in Idaho, which suggests to me that they were trying to basically, give the finger to the population, and politely didn't, and I dare you to say something about it. I dare you to do something about it. Whereas that vibe was under BLM, but they really wanted people I'm sorry about racism. Nobody's sorry about saying no to sex with children. Nobody's sorry about that. So I think this was more intentionally Biden's in the White House and you can't stop us, I dare you to try provocation.
That's interesting. I kind of want to shift directions to what's going on in society now with you specifically. So you came out with this idea of woke right. And I would say, I believe there is the woke right in theory. I believe horseshoe theory completely because you see it every day, how close a lot of the people on the far left and the far right actually are. But I kind of want to start, like, what would be your definition of woke?
That's what I said earlier. It's that you believe the fundamental organizing principle of society is basically oppressor versus oppressed. But what you have is a in-group, and again, it's got to be how society is organized in its totality. It's a system of power. It's not a location of power. One of the key points that the critical race theorists made, just to clarify this, is it's not that we have institutional racism, right? And in fact, they made the point often with the civil rights era, we overcame a lot of our individual, but not all, and a lot of our institutional racism, but that wasn't it. It's structural and systemic racism. It's an all-pervasive operating principle for society that we're actually up against, which is why everything and everything else was also racist. So Robin DiAngelo said the question is not did racism occur, but how did racism manifest in the situation? Racism is in the sense imminent, that it's underneath every interaction, right? That's a different view than some people are racist or some institutions are racist. So woke means believing that about some insider group has created a system dynamics for the entire operation of society that's designed to marginalize and exclude some deserving group that sees itself as an excluded class, rather than, sometimes there's oppression or the government doesn't like, because of diversity we have to do this, unfair hiring practices and whatever else.
Yeah, and so with the woke right, I could totally see where you're coming from with that, because there are a lot of people on the woke right who see, or on the right, who would say, who are just as racist. They want a white suppressive society. It's not just white supremacists, but there's the people who only talk about Jewish people, or they only talk about what's happening in the hood with black people.
And the question is,
and they're obsessed with race.
Is that their organizing principle for society, right? The DEI is an organizing principle for society that is designed to exclude, not just by their skin color or whatever, people like them, but people who think like them, people who are like them. If you believe it's the fundamental organizing principle of society that is so deeply entrenched that the only way you can overcome it is through a revolution, because and through critique, you can't actually make arguments and counter to it that people might find more persuasive. You have to make critique after critique, because there's nothing you can do from within the system to change the system. Then you're in a woke situation. So it's not, I dislike what Israel's doing. That's not woke. You're perfectly free to doubt a state. You're perfectly free to doubt the activities of the Mossad or the government, the current government, or the government in general. It doesn't particularly matter. But if you believe that the Jews secretly rig everything in the world so that you can't get ahead, you're woke about Jews. And if you think that, the purpose of the DEI apparatus is not to install a Marxist program, which it is, but you think it's specifically to make sure white people can't succeed in society, you're woke about DEI. You are misunderstanding what it is in a way that you say, basically, I can't succeed because there's a system of power preventing me from succeeding. And that's a different mentality. The challenge is that left and right don't think the same way. So with the left, they're generally, in a sense, universalist in a way. They think all of humanity is intrinsically, let's use CRT, they're intrinsically anti-racist, whatever that means, or intrinsically socialist, or intrinsically queer if you need a different touch point, intrinsically, fat acceptance, whatever touch point you need to understand. But we'll say intrinsically anti-racist. But we've been alienated from anti-racism by the imposition of racial identity and racism by the white power structure that created a form of private property called whiteness that they now impose. So we have whiteness, we exclude everybody else from whiteness, therefore everybody else is oppressed by the fact of white supremacy of that kind. Therefore we need to seize the means of production of what it means to be racially identified so that we can overthrow the system. That's CRT, right? That's woke. So there's a universalism there. All human beings on earth, in their opinion, are alienated from their true being by dint of whiteness and white supremacy. White people are alienated because they become oppressors. People of color is the term of art, and especially black and indigenous people are alienated by dint of having racism applied to them, imposed on them is the word they usually use. And so everybody's alienated from their true sense of who they are by this system. The right does not think in that universal. You're not trying, everybody is not something. They think in terms of the group, the nation in particular. And the nation might be defined politically, ethnically, or culturally, but there's an intrinsic nation that should be the inheritors of society, but we became too tolerant, and these interlopers came in and displaced the heritage people who should inherit the society. So they're not thinking, it's not racism, it's the people who should be the inheritors of the American, literally, heritage.
Yeah.
Are not getting it now because we were too tolerant. So rather than we need to increase tolerance on the left, we now need to decrease tolerance on the right in order to restore the proper order. And only those of us who've been properly, awakened to what suffering means by being marginalized by this system, whether it's anti-whiteness or whether it's the post-war liberal consensus, or whether it's a Jewish conspiracy theory, anti-Semitism is the name for the Jewish conspiracy theory. We have awakened to a higher truth, therefore we are elite, and we need to take power to control, to make sure that this doesn't happen and the common good can come about again.
Yeah, and I think that's where I had concerns, because we were talking about this the other day, and I told you, I said, I feel like the way that it's been presented, and I've seen it online, and being the way that it just kind of comes across has always been, I always thought you were a little bit overbroad, where I would say that I think, because I would see, and you brought up Israel, and I think that's the big one, because it was always the fight with Dave Smith, and I kind of looked at that, and I'm like, Dave Smith is more like me, a libertarian, where I don't believe our government should be funding any foreign nation. I think Israel has a right to exist, but I'm very concerned about what they're doing in Gaza and some of the ways that they're handling the operations. And so I have concerns, even as a veteran myself. And so when I see you going after somebody like Dave Smith for some of his views, now I understand Dave sometimes runs in these crowds, and he has friends, but I also feel like a little bit of that's guilty by association.
Yeah, well, with Dave, let me clarify, because Dave's not woke right. Dave's a libertarian, right? Yeah. He's an anti-war libertarian. We could get into whether he's woke as a libertarian, as an what I call a critical government theorist, which is the same critical theory, but now government's a system of power. We don't have to get into the details of that. But what happened was, I didn't actually even know who Dave Smith is. You ever go to like a park or something, and like a little dog starts following you, and it just keeps following you, and you don't know how you got this dog that's following you? Well, I know how I picked up Dave as my little dog here, but it's like this incidental thing. Dave was saying something about Israel at a time when I was being pressed for examples of what is the woke right. I didn't know who Dave was, but he was saying the same thing that the anti-Semites were saying. Okay. Right? And I said, here's an example of woke right. I didn't say it that way, I said woke right. Just quote tweeted him and said woke right. So Dave, and lots of people, obviously Dave has some, we'll call them very active followers and supporters, latched on to the idea of me calling him woke right, and that's the little dog that started following me, and it's never stopped following me. And I'm like, please go away, little dog, you're not woke right. Maybe you're a critical government theorist, or you're just an anti-war libertarian or whatever, but you're not even on the right, so you're not woke right. Like, woke right means that you have all the woke worldview and the woke practices like cancel culture, victimhood identity, identity politics, class-based conflict orientation, etc. And you advocate right-wing positions and claim right-wing as an identity, right? Not even conservative, right-wing. Okay. Dave's a libertarian, doesn't apply. Yeah. Okay, so I messed up. I called Dave woke right when I was looking for examples. He said something that sounds the same as what they say. I didn't even know who he was. He's just this vague character that was on the fringes of my awareness on Twitter. He has a big following, but I didn't follow him, so I didn't know who he was. And it's like, that was so many months ago, and it's just like never gone away.
It's not going away.
And it's like, I don't know how to, like, there's this kind of very fine people hoax going on about what I've said about this issue, and a lot of it's not people making a mistake, it is deliberate, where I have said some very specific, very clear, sometimes not as clear things about woke right, and there has been a deflection campaign to make people believe that I've applied it in a ridiculously irresponsible way, in a completely vague way. It's a term with no meaning. I just told you what the meaning is. It's extremely specific. It applies to a small percentage of the political right, if we use that framing. And a lot of people are like taking tweets that I've had out of context. Some of them are doctored. Things that I've written, again, out of context. Things that I said years ago, again, out of context. And pinning me to say, oh, well, James would say the founding fathers are woke right. No, I don't. I've given long arguments for why that's not the case. For example, that they believed in divided powers and no centralized authority, right?
Yeah.
That'd be one reason. Woke likes seizing the means of production of society, not distributing it to the individuals.
Yeah.
It's individualist versus collectivist here, right? But that's a lot of other reasons. And James would say that, he says Nick Fuentes and, Yoram Hazony and Nate Fisher and Dave Smith are all the same. No, I don't. I've never said they're all the same. I said that just like you have race woke people and you have queer woke people and you have feminist woke people and you have your annoying cousin who you can't have Thanksgiving dinner with anymore. You have Kamala Harris, and then you have Antifa, right? We call them woke. Nobody hesitates to say Antifa's woke, Kamala Harris is woke, and my annoying cousin is woke, even though they're very different people. It's the same thing on the right. There are different groups at different levels of radicalization and different levels of behavior. And then you got poor puppy dog Dave Smith has latched on because I called him woke right once or twice maybe, and he never let it go. I have this bad habit also, like if people poke me, I just keep poking back. Like James called Matt Walsh woke right. Well, it's not exactly. Matt said, maybe I'm woke right. And I was like, well, yeah, you probably are, right? But I'm just being glib. I'm just being a jerk back because he's being a jerk. Right? It was just like give as you take or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So Matt's probably not woke right either. But it's like, no, I'm very specific about who I mean it by. But one other thing, like your cousin versus Kamala Harris versus your gender studies professor versus Antifa, it's not just that there are different ways of being woke. There's also like you can be a little woke. Right? We all know Democrat people who are mostly normal and then they're a little woke and you kind of like, they're hard to talk to, they're a little woke, right? But you can generally get along with them. And then there's the people like, they're just screaming all the time. They're like evergreen meltdown people. Same thing with woke right. There are people who have a little bit of this like, I'm the oppressed white guy or whatever, and then you have like the full blast, we need a theocracy to solve this with only white people, in theology world, they call that kinism. So we need a kinist theology or theocracy, or whatever. That's pretty damn woke, actually.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I think that there's a lot of layers to the issue. And like you said, I was going to say Matt Walsh is another example. I wouldn't necessarily consider him woke right.
No, he's a curmudgeon is what he and a provocateur.
Right, exactly. So there is a level of like what I would say is like the far right, like the gripers and stuff like that, probably woke right. Yes, very much woke right.
Very much woke right.
I would very much say that they are. But then you start to move a little bit further, and you do have what I used to just consider social conservatives, who are more socially apt and want more of a theocracy. They would say, everybody can live in America, but we want a Christo-nationalist society, and that's where I would say, the Matt Walshes of society probably live in that area. And I wouldn't necessarily consider that woke, but like you're saying, there is still an identitarian factor to it. I think that's kind of the overarching theme. And you're right.
There's a gray boundary. It's like your annoying woke cousin, and it's like there's like this fuzzy, like they get real annoying when issues around race come up, but other than that, they're like pretty normal, right? There's this, it's not like a binary, like you're totally normal or you're all the way woke. It's a dip out of realism and into idealism is what it is. So you can be a little more idealistic until finally you leave reality entirely. But most people have this sort of unexamined blend of being realistic about the world, but a little idealistic. I wish it was better and different, right? But in a way that's actually philosophically idealist or constructivist, which is what woke thinking is.
And what's really interesting, because even in the libertarian community, we do have this, we say left-right paradigm, I guess.
Paradigm.
Paradigm. Thank you. And so it would be this idea that, like, if you look at somebody, like, there's the left side, I guess you would say, who do view, like, they have the woke ideas when it comes to, like, the LGBT community and some of the other things, and you see it, and it's like, well, that's pretty woke, but you also would just believe in individual liberty, and you're not necessarily doing on that. But your views on this fall within that woke category, which is where, I think Dave fell in on the right, and he has some of those views that you could see blending in, and you could see why he associates with some of those people in different aspects, but doesn't necessarily fit in the category. But James, I appreciate you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I hope this clarifies some stuff up too, and
I hope
it helps
so.
get you uncanceled,
Yeah, we'll see if I get uncanceled.
But I understand that too. It's like when people come after you, they take all your views out of context. They don't necessarily do it, and you can scream into a microphone 100 times and nobody's listening to it because they don't want to listen to your words anymore. They just want perception. So.
By the way, I didn't call these people. I didn't make up the term woke, right? That's a term that's been in circulation since 22. People were writing articles about it in 23 and in early 24, or through 24, early 25, this was all 24. Early 24, way before I started in fall of 24, right? I have my dates a little messed up. I started in about September calling them woke right, but this is a term that's been floating around 2 years by this point. The reason I started calling them woke right, I called them new right, dissident right, post-liberal right, these kinds of terms. I started using woke only after they started canceling me. And they didn't cancel me initially for calling them woke. They canceled me initially for saying something that was clumsy about the Archangel Michael. And I'm like, why are they going after me like a leftist struggle session over, I get it, maybe it's a little clumsy, but they went berserk on me.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is full-scale operational, take me off the table.
Yeah.
I'm like, they're acting like woke people. I'm calling them woke right from now on. Well, I hesitated to use that term for a long time.
Yeah. Well, in the struggle session is another area where we don't have time to talk about it, but that's an area where you see it.
I live it.
It's like, well, yeah, so you can tell that they use the same tactics in the same way, and that struggle session is exactly what it is.
That's right.
But again, thank you for joining, and I look forward to our panel tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be great.
We'll have some more of this conversation, and we'll continue it later on.
Well, thanks so much.